What would you do if an HOA president called the police to force you off a lake you inherited, only to discover she didn't actually own the land she was standing on? I'm not asking hypothetically. I lived it. My name is Sarah Whitlock, and I drove 10 hours straight to a quiet lake property my father left me, expecting nothing more dramatic than weeds, old docks, and paperwork. The plan was simple. Unlock the gate, walk the shoreline, breathe for the first time in months. I'd taken time off work, packed light, and imagined still water and birdsong. Instead, I arrived to flashing lights, a patrol cruiser idling by the boat ramp, and a woman in designer athleisure pointing at me like she'd already won. "You can't be here," she said before I even shut my door. "This is private HOA property." That was my first clue something was wrong. The lake hadn't changed much since I was a kid, same curve of shoreline, same tall pines, but everything around it had. Where there used to be dirt paths and fishing spots, there were signs. Copper Ridge Estate. Members only. No trespassing. The woman introduced herself as the HOA president, spoke fast and loud, and used the word trespassing like it was a magic spell. I told her calmly that this was my land. That I had the deed. That my family had owned this stretch of shoreline since the late 1980s. She smiled the way people do when they think you're confused. "That's not how it works anymore," she said. "We handle everything now." Before I could respond, she stepped away, pulled out her phone, and dialed. Loudly. Deliberately. So I could hear every word. "Yes, hello? I need officers at the lake. There's a woman refusing to leave HOA property. She's being confrontational." I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't even stepped onto the dock yet. 10 minutes later, the police arrived. 2 officers. Neutral expressions. Hands resting casually on their belt. The HOA president walked over like this was a performance she'd rehearsed. She handed them a folder, tapped the top page, and started explaining how they paid dues, they maintained the shoreline, and outsiders were becoming a problem. I stood there holding my keys, my bag still in the passenger seat, wondering how a peaceful inheritance had turned into a scene from a bad legal drama. One officer turned to me. "Ma'am, do you have proof this property belongs to you?" I said yes. I always say yes to that question. I keep copies in my glove compartment, my email, and my cloud storage. My father was meticulous. He didn't trust handshake agreements or verbal promises. He trusted paper. I handed the officer the deed. The HOA president scoffed. "That's outdated. Our development absorbed this land years ago." The officer didn't argue. He didn't react at all. He just looked down at the document, then at the folder she'd given him, then back at the deed. Something subtle shifted. The other officer leaned in. "Mind if we run the parcel numbers?" he asked. The HOA president's posture tightened. "That won't be necessary. This has all been settled." The officer was already walking back to his car. As we waited, the lake went quiet. No birds. No wind. Just the hum of the cruiser's engine and the faint click of a keyboard inside. The HOA president crossed her arms and stared straight ahead, jaw set. She didn't look at me once. When the officer came back, his tone had changed. Professional, but careful. "Ma'am," he said to her, "according to county land records, this section of shoreline is not part of your HOA." She laughed. A sharp, dismissive sound. "That's impossible." He turned the screen so she could see. The smile drained from her face. For the first time since I arrived, no one was talking. And that's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. While the officers compared maps and parcel numbers, I found myself staring past them at the water, letting memories do what stress always makes them do, surface uninvited. My father bought this place in 1989. He was a civil surveyor by trade, the kind of man who measured twice and argued once, and only if he had documentation to back it up. The lake wasn't an investment to him. It was an anchor. After my mom died, this was where he came to think, to grieve, to reset. He taught me how to read contour lines here. How to spot bad measurements. How to respect boundaries. Real ones, not the kind people invent when they want something that isn't theirs. When he got sick, he made me promise one thing: don't ever let anyone tell you what this land is worth. Not in money. Not in power. That promise was why I'd driven all night instead of selling it sight unseen like the realtor suggested. It was why I kept every document he ever gave me. Deeds, surveys, tax receipts, handwritten notes explaining why a boundary marker sat 3 feet east instead of west. My father didn't just own land. He understood it. And standing there, watching an HOA president try to erase that history with confidence and volume, I realized how deliberate this all was. The officers finished their check and stepped aside to talk quietly. The HOA president, Karen, didn't feel like a stereotype here, it felt like a title, paced near the dock, phone clenched in her hand. I caught fragments of her whispering, "That can't be right. We paid." "That's not what the developer said." Developer. That word stuck. Because developments don't absorb land. They buy it. They document it. They record it. And if they don't, it's not an oversight, it's a strategy. One of the officers came back to me. "Ma'am, how long has your family owned this parcel?" 34 years, I said. "Continuously. Taxes paid every year." He nodded slowly. "That lines up." The HOA president spun around. "This is ridiculous. We've maintained this shoreline for years. Our residents use it. We have signage. We have dues." I couldn't help myself. Maintenance doesn't equal ownership. She shot me a look sharp enough to cut. "You people always say that. You people." The phrase landed heavier than she probably intended. That was the moment it clicked. She wasn't just annoyed. She was threatened. Because her authority here didn't come from law, it came from assumption. From people not checking. From no one pushing back. The officers told her, politely but firmly, that I had every right to be there. That unless a court said otherwise, the land was mine. That calling the police again without cause could become an issue. Her face flushed. "So that's it? She just gets to walk in here and undo years of work." Undo. Like my family's ownership was an inconvenience she'd been fixing. They left soon after, the cruiser rolling away and taking the immediate tension with it. But something worse replaced it: certainty. The kind that tells you this isn't over. That people who build their power on shaky ground don't just stop when they're exposed, they double down. I walked the shoreline alone after that. Found the old boundary marker my dad had hammered in himself, half buried but still there. I found new signs bolted into trees that weren't on HOA land. I found a dock extension that crossed a line it shouldn't have. This wasn't an accident. This was slow-motion theft, dressed up as community order. And as the sun dipped lower over the lake, I understood the real stake. This wasn't just about one confrontation or one Karen with a folder. It was about how easily ownership gets rewritten when people stop paying attention. My father had warned me about that. What I didn't know yet was how far this HOA had already gone, or how much they were hiding just beneath the surface. I didn't leave the lake that night. Instead, I parked my car near the old access road and slept in it, waking up every few hours to the sound of water against the rocks and the low hum of distant generators from the HOA side. By morning, whatever shock I'd felt the day before had settled into something colder and more focused. If they were willing to call the police on day one, this wasn't going to be solved with a polite email. I started where my father always started. Records. County Assessor's office opened at 9. I was there at 8:45, coffee in hand, asking for parcel maps, historical plats, and any amendments filed in the last 10 years. The clerk didn't seem surprised by my request. That alone told me a lot. "You're not the first one to ask about Copper Ridge," she said, sliding a stack of printouts across the counter. The maps confirmed what the officer had seen the night before. My shoreline parcel was intact, clearly defined, and never transferred. But the newer HOA maps told a different story, one that subtly redrew boundaries, shaved off edges, and labeled my land as common area. Not sold. Not leased. Just relabeled. I asked how those HOA maps were approved. She hesitated. They were submitted as part of a development package. Not recorded deeds. Supplemental documents. Meaning they'd never legally changed ownership. They'd just been filed and assumed. That assumption was the crack everything else started spilling out of. Over the next 2 days, I walked the entire boundary with a measuring wheel and my father's original survey note. I photographed every sign, every fence, every dock extension that crossed the line. I took timestamps, GPS coordinate, wide shots and close-ups. That's when the pressure started. First came the emails. Polite, firm, CC'd to an HOA address that suddenly existed for me. You are accessing restricted areas. Please coordinate future visits with the board. Failure to comply may result in enforcement action. Then came the letters. A formal notice slid under my windshield wiper while I was photographing a retaining wall. It claimed I owed back dues for unauthorized use of HOA amenities. Another warned of fines for disrupting community harmony. They were escalating on paper, trying to create a narrative where I was the problem. By day 3, someone followed me. A white SUV crawled along the access road while I took photos near the dock. When I stopped, it stopped. When I turned around, it turned off. No confrontation. Just presence. The message was clear. We see you. That night, I reviewed everything on my laptop and noticed something I'd missed before. A section of shoreline the HOA claimed as maintained wetlands had fresh grading marks. Too fresh. And the water there looked wrong, cloudy, with a faint chemical sheen that didn't match the rest of the lake. The next morning, I met Tom. He was a retired environmental inspector who lived 2 miles up the road and had been fishing this lake longer than the HOA had existed. I recognized his name from a handwritten note in my father's files. Tom knows the water. Trust him. He took one look at the shoreline photos and frowned. That's runoff. And it's not natural. He explained it calmly, like someone who'd had this conversation too many times. Improper drainage. Unpermitted work. Possible discharge into protected water. Did they file anything with the state? He asked. I shook my head. Then they're in trouble, he said. Real trouble. Word started spreading after that. Quietly. A dock builder who hadn't been paid. A landscaper who was told his invoice was invalid. A resident who thought her lot was lakefront until she saw my survey. Every conversation added weight. Every detail fit a pattern. The HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were operating on the assumption that no one would ever check closely enough to stop them. By the end of the week, I had a folder thick enough to make any lawyer pause. And the HOA president knew it. She stopped emailing. Instead, I got a voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled, and just a little angry. This is getting out of hand, she said. We need to resolve this privately before it becomes messy. That was the word she chose. Messy. And that's when I knew I was no longer just investigating. I was threatening something she couldn't afford to lose. The HOA president didn't wait long after that voicemail. 2 days later, she showed up at the lake with an attorney. I was standing near the old dock, remeasuring a boundary marker my father had installed decades ago, when a black sedan pulled up and parked sideways across the access road. She stepped out first, sunglasses on, posture rigid, followed by a man in a tailored suit holding a leather folder like a shield. Let's clear this up, she said, skipping pleasantries. You're creating unnecessary conflict. The lawyer took over immediately, speaking in that smooth, practiced tone meant to intimidate without raising volume. He talked about community use, implied easements, adverse possession, and good faith development. He never once said they owned the land outright. That omission mattered. I let him finish. Then I handed him a copy of my father's original survey, the county tax history, and the GPS-stamped photos of every encroachment. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just waited while he read. His confidence faded line by line. That dock extension, I said quietly, pointing toward the water, crosses my boundary by 14 feet. The grading over there. I nodded toward the cloudy shoreline. Unpermitted work within a protected buffer zone. And these HOA maps. I tapped the stack. They were never recorded as conveyances. The HOA president snapped, "That's your interpretation." The lawyer didn't agree. He closed the folder slowly. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we'll need time to review this." She turned on him. "Review what?" "This is our lake." He didn't respond. That was the moment the balance shifted. Within 48 hours the retaliation started. My tires were chalked twice in one day. A notice appeared claiming I was violating noise ordinances, despite the fact that I was alone and silent. Someone removed 2 boundary flags overnight. And then, just after midnight, a spotlight flicked on outside my car and stayed on for 10 full minutes before shutting off. Intimidation. Small, deniable, deliberate. I didn't react publicly. I documented everything. The real collapse began when Tom filed an anonymous environmental tip with the state, backed by his credentials and my photos. Inspectors arrived quietly the following week, took samples, and left without speaking to the HOA. That silence terrified them. The HOA president called me again. This time, she wasn't controlled. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. "There are families here. Investments. You're putting people at risk." "I'm not," I replied. "You are." She hung up. 3 days later, a public notice went up. Emergency HOA meeting regarding shoreline compliance. I attended. The room was full. Residents, board members, and a few people who looked like they hadn't slept. The HOA president stood at the front, trying to project authority, but the questions came fast. Why were boundaries being redrawn? Why were docks being flagged for inspection? Why were there rumors about environmental violations? She deflected. Blamed misunderstandings. Claimed I was exaggerating. Then one resident stood up. "My lot was sold as lakefront," she said. "Is it?" No answer. Another asked why contractors were filing liens. Someone else asked why inspectors were on site. The lawyer tried to intervene. It didn't help. That's when the state notice arrived. A formal investigation into unpermitted shoreline work and potential discharge into protected waters. Stop work orders effective immediately. The room went silent. The HOA president's face drained of color. Her authority, built on assumption, volume, and people not checking, collapsed in real time. Outside, after the meeting, she confronted me one last time. "You think you've won?" she said, voice shaking. "This will ruin people." I looked past her at the lake. Calm. Patient. Unmoved. "No," I said. "The truth just caught up." She didn't reply. And for the first time since this began, she walked away without another word. But the consequences were only just beginning. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected, and slower than justice ever should. State inspectors returned with equipment, clipboards, and a seriousness that doesn't show up unless someone has already confirmed a problem. They marked the shoreline with bright tape, photographed the runoff Tom had warned about, and traced drainage paths back to their source. It didn't take long. The HOA's maintenance improvements had rerouted water straight into the lake without permits, filters, or approvals. The stop work order expanded into fines, then into enforcement. Residents started asking questions the board couldn't answer. Why dues were rising. Why amenities were suddenly closed. Why lawyers were suddenly present at every meeting. The HOA president stopped sending emails altogether. Her name quietly disappeared from the board roster a month later. No announcement. No apology. Just absence. The docks that crossed my boundary were dismantled under supervision. Signs came down. Boundary markers went back in. This time installed by a licensed surveyor with county witnesses present. The lake began to look like itself again, slowly shedding the clutter that never belonged there. One afternoon, I found the old access path my father used to walk. Someone had tried to block it years earlier with decorative stones. I cleared them by hand and stood there for a long time, listening to water lap against the shore the way it always had. That was when it finally felt real. Not the confrontation. Not the police. Not the HOA's collapse. Ownership. Not just of land, but of the truth. The investigation concluded quietly. No dramatic arrests. No viral headlines. Just official findings, corrective orders, and a settlement that forced the HOA to restore what they'd altered and disclose what they'd hidden. Several residents filed civil claims. The developer who'd submitted those misleading maps was named directly in the report. Assumptions, it turns out, don't hold up well against records. I didn't sell the property. Instead, I did what my father would have done. I placed a conservation easement on the shoreline, protecting it from future redefinitions. It limits development permanently and ensures access stays exactly where it's always been. The lake doesn't need improving. It needs respecting. Every now and then, I still see someone slow their car near the access road, reading the new signage, recalibrating what they thought they knew. They don't argue. They don't challenge. They check the record. And that's the part that stays with me. Not that an HOA Karen tried to use the police to force me off my own land, but how easily she thought it would work. How often it probably had before. How many people might have walked away, intimidated, exhausted, convinced they were wrong because someone louder told them so. Quiet injustice thrives on that. Quiet justice ends it. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that truth doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It just needs to be documented, defended, and allowed to stand on its own. Systems built on shortcuts collapse when someone finally refuses to take one. So if you've ever been told something was already settled, or that pushing back would be messy, remember this: boundaries don't move just because someone says they do. Rights don't vanish because they're inconvenient. And the moment you check the records, the entire balance can change. This story wasn't about winning an argument. It was about stopping a lie. If stories like this matter to you, stories where patience beats power and proof outlasts pressure, you're already part of quiet justice. And there are more truths waiting to be checked.